what if, what if the very rules that are designed to protect a free society are actually the exact tools that can be used to dismantle it?
Right.
Like, I really want you to just think about that for a second. Because we are completely conditioned to view things like constitutional rights, procedural fairness, freedom of speech as this impenetrable fortress.
Oh, absolutely.
We just assume these defensive walls can only ever be used to keep threats out. But if you actually sit down and look at the structural mechanics of a constitutional republic, you start to realize a terrifying paradox.
Yeah.
Which is that a lock doesn't actually care who turns the key.
It really doesn't. And that is it's a profound vulnerability. And it's one of those things that usually stays completely hidden until the system is already under immense stress.
Right, because everything looks fine on a sunny day.
Exactly. The assumption that a shield can only ever be used as a shield is precisely what makes a free society so incredibly fragile when it suddenly encounters a movement that, that views that shield as a weapon.
Yes. And that paradox right there is the core of Jamie Thornberry's recent work, which is what we are digging into today.
It's fascinating stuff.
It really is. So for this deep dive, we are examining two of his essays. One is called Political and Religion's Constitutional Notes on Issues They Didn't See Coming, a bit of a mouthful. And the other is called The Door That Opens Both Ways.
Both are just packed with insight.
They are. And our mission today is to explore a very specific, almost hidden vulnerability in the architecture of the American Constitutional Republic. Specifically, we're looking at the inherent catastrophic risks of treating all belief systems as legally equivalent.
Right. And, just to jump in here, I think we need to set some ground rules for this conversation.
Oh, yeah, please do. That's crucial.
So just so we are completely clear with you listening, while this material obviously touches on deeply held convictions, religious beliefs, and political ideologies, this deep dive is strictly an impartial exploration.
Totally impartial.
We are just looking at Thornberry's structural and philosophical analysis. We are looking at the literal blueprint of the system itself. We are not here to take sides in modern political warfare or endorse any specific ideology.
Exactly. I mean, to analyze a building's structural integrity, you don't argue about what color the walls are painted or who gets to live in the master bedroom, right?
Right. You look at the foundation. You look at the load-bearing pillars. You look at how the materials actually handle stress under pressure.
And Thornberry gives us this really brilliant organizing metaphor for this whole concept. He says the founders basically built a house with these heavy, wide-open doors.
Yeah, the doors that open both ways.
Right, doors that are designed to swing freely in both directions so that individual conscience can just walk in and out completely freely without the state demanding a password at the door.
Which was revolutionary at the time.
Completely revolutionary. But to understand why those doors were built that way to begin with and why they are currently a massive vulnerability, we really have to look at the fires that inspired the house's construction in the first place.
We do, because you really can't understand the rules of the system until you understand the trauma that designed them.
Yeah.
Like the American constitutional order wasn't just brainstormed in a vacuum. It wasn't just a bunch of Enlightenment philosophers sitting around, sipping tea in a peaceful garden, drawing up utopian ideas.
Right. It wasn't just a fun thought experiment.
Not at all. It was designed by men who had this deeply inherited collective memory of Europe literally burning itself to the ground over God.
Yeah, the European wars of religion, I think people today really underestimate how visceral that history was to them.
Oh, they totally do.
Yeah.
When we talk about the separation of church and state today, we usually treat it as this polite administrative rule,
Right.
like zoning laws.
Like keeping the noise down after 10 p.m.
Exactly. But to men like Thomas Jefferson or James Madison, the religious wars in Europe were the defining cautionary tale of human history, period. I mean, for roughly a century and a half, basically, from the beginning of the Reformation all the way through the 30 Years' War, the European continent just slaughtered itself.
Millions of people died.
Millions. Entire cities wiped out. And what was the core issue of all that bloodshed?
It was essentially a fight over which religious confession held the right to command the conscience of the public.
Right. And not just command it spiritually, but command it through the coercive power of the state. through the military, the police, the executioner.
So wait, let's unpack that, because it wasn't just a polite theological debate.
No, not at all.
It wasn't just scholars at a university arguing over the interpretation of communion or baptism.
No.
It was this deeply held belief that if you didn't force your specific theology onto the entire population using the king's army, your entire society was damned.
Precisely. If you let heretics live in your kingdom, God would punish the kingdom. So you had a moral duty to kill them or convert them.
Which is just terrifying.
It is. And because of that nightmare, the conclusion the founders drew was structural, not sentimental.
Okay, structural, not sentimental. Expand on that, because that's a huge distinction Thornberry makes.
Right, so the founders didn't separate liberty of conscience from civil authority because they thought religion was trivial, or because they thought, faith should be kept private out of politeness at dinner parties.
Right, they were mostly religious men themselves.
Exactly. They separated them because they understood a mechanical reality. Anytime you merge a divine mandate with civil coercion, you inherently produce tyranny, every single time.
Because you can't compromise with a divine mandate.
You can't. If God tells you to pass a tax law, you can't negotiate a lower rate with the opposition. You have to crush the opposition. And the founders had the mass graves in Europe to prove that this equation always equals death.
And Thornberry points out something really interesting here, too. They didn't just critique European Christianity.
Right. They looked at a broad range of historical examples.
Yeah, they looked at Ottoman Turkey. They looked at periods of extreme papal political dominance in Italy. And their critique remained entirely structural across all of it. It didn't actually matter what the specific theology was.
That's the key. They viewed any regime that merged faith and force as structurally defective. Period.
Yeah. It's the mechanism itself.
Yes. If the state is allowed to enforce orthodoxy, any orthodoxy, the state becomes an instrument of terror. It really doesn't matter who is sitting on the throne or what holy book they happen to be holding. The mechanism of merging those two things is the problem.
It makes me think of building codes.
Okay, yeah, go on.
So imagine a society that survived this horrific, generations-long series of house fires, entire neighborhoods burning down for 100 years.
That sounds terrible.
Right. And they finally, after all this destruction, figure out that the fires were all caused by the electrical wiring coming into direct contact with the plumbing.
Oh, I see where you're going.
Right. Like the water and the electricity mixing is what sparked the fires. So when they finally draft the building codes for their new nation, their entire architectural focus is going to be on making sure the wiring and the plumbing never, ever touch.
That is a perfect analogy.
It's not that they hate electricity, and it's not that they hate water. They need both. They just know that if the two merge, the house burns down.
That really captures the structural isolation Thornberry is talking about. In your analogy, the wiring is the realm of conscience. It's spiritual conviction. It's the individual's accountability before God. It's the internal life.
Right.
And the plumbing is civil coercion. The magistrate, the state, the temporal power that is used to keep the peace, pave the roads, and protect natural rights.
You need the plumbing for a functioning house.
You absolutely do. Both the wiring and the plumbing are necessary for a society to function. But the foundational rule of the new American Republic was that they must be kept strictly apart.
The magistrate does not save souls, and the church does not wield the sword.
Exactly. The sword and the cross are separated. And for a long time, historically speaking, that worked really well.
It did. It successfully stopped the religious wars from crossing the Atlantic and happening on American soil.
It really was an architectural triumph.
But, and this is where we get into the meat of Thornberry's argument, if I'm following his logic correctly, that very success bred a massive blind spot.
It did. It bred complacency.
Right, because the architectural separation was so effective, it allowed this completely unwritten assumption to take root at the very heart of the system.
Yes, and this is a crucial concept. Every design, no matter how brilliant, carries a premise that the designers never explicitly state.
Because to them, it's just obvious.
Exactly. In their era, it's too obvious to even mention. The founders built this incredibly open house, right?
Yeah.
But they made a massive load-bearing assumption about the people who'd be walking through those wide-open doors.
What was the assumption?
They assumed that all participants in the polity, every faction, every group, would accept the constitutional order as a permanent settlement, rather than a temporary tactical posture.
Okay, wait, let's slow down and define that, because this seems to be the absolute hinge of the entire essay.
It is.
What does it actually mean for a faction to treat the Constitution as a temporary tactical posture?
To really understand this, we have to look at a phrase Thornberry uses, which is civilizational grammar.
Civilizational grammar.
Right. So the founders fully expected factions to argue. They weren't naive. Madison famously wrote all about factions. They expected brutal, endless, nasty debates about taxation, foreign policy, the scope of the federal government.
Sure, just normal politics?
Right, normal politics. But they assumed all those arguments would happen using a shared language. They assumed everyone implicitly agreed on the fundamental grammar of the system, namely that the distinction between spiritual conviction and temporal law was a permanently settled matter.
So a permanent settlement means you agree to the foundational rules of the game.
Yes. You accept the rules even when you lose an election. You accept them when you lose a court case. You don't try to flip the board over.
Right. Which means a temporary tactical posture is the exact opposite.
Exactly. A temporary tactical posture means you are only participating in the system. You are only playing the game to gain enough power to eventually eliminate the system itself.
You're using the rules to get close enough to destroy the rule book.
Precisely. You don't believe in the separation of wiring and plumbing at all. You were just using the open doors of the house to get inside so you can rip the wires out.
But wait, I have a question here on behalf of anyone listening. If these guys, these founders, were such brilliant political architects, and I mean, Madison was famously, notoriously paranoid about the concentration of power, how did they miss this?
It's a great question.
Like, why wasn't there a failsafe written into the Constitution to explicitly protect the framework from people who wanted to use the framework to destroy it?
It really comes down to the limits of their historical imagination.
Really? Just a lack of imagination.
Well, you have to remember, they were products of the Enlightenment. They had seen religious zealotry, yes, but they simply couldn't conceive of a modern faction treating a neutral procedural framework as an instrument to be captured and repurposed for totalizing ends from the inside.
Because it just didn't compute with their worldview?
Right. In their minds, why would you walk into the house unless you wanted to live there? If you hated the house, if you wanted to destroy the house, they assumed you would do it from the outside.
Like with an invading army? Or a direct violent rebellion?
Exactly. They built fortresses and armies to repel outside invaders, but they didn't anticipate the saboteur who, signs a lease, pays rent on time, brings cookies to the neighborhood watch meeting, and then quietly starts removing the load-bearing walls from the inside.
Oh, wow. So the vulnerability isn't that the walls are physically weak?
No, the walls are quite strong.
The vulnerability is the assumption that everyone who walks through the door recognizes the walls as walls, rather than obstacles that need to be dismantled.
That is exactly it.
And when that unwritten assumption fails, when someone walks in who doesn't share that civilizational grammar, we hit this core concept Thornberry talks about, the asymmetry of procedural tolerance.
Yes, the asymmetry. This is where the whole system starts to buckle.
Because this is where the legal equivalency of all worldviews becomes a catastrophic risk, right? Walk me through how this asymmetry actually functions.
So, when a constitutional republic is built entirely on procedural tolerance, it has this profound asymmetry just baked right into its legal code.
How so?
The system is designed to treat every competing worldview as a functionally equivalent variant of private opinion.
Okay.
So in the eyes of the law, every belief system is just another flavor of conscience. Whether you are a Quaker who just wants to quietly farm and pray, or a radical ideologue who believes the state should be overthrown and replaced with a theocracy, the system looks at both of you and says, yep, those are just two private opinions.
But wait, I can hear the pushback right now. If we start drawing lines between acceptable beliefs and unacceptable beliefs, aren't we just creating the exact tyranny the founders were trying to escape?
That is the exact argument that gets used.
Like, if the government gets to decide which beliefs are safe and which are dangerous, we are right back to the religious wars of Europe. Tolerance has to be perfectly neutral, or it isn't tolerance at all.
And that is the exact tension that paralyzes modern republics today. It's a brilliant observation. We have conflated a conscience seeking the freedom to exist with a political theology seeking the power to rule.
Wow. Say that again. Conscience seeking freedom to exist versus...
Versus a political theology seeking the power to rule.
Okay, that makes it so clear.
Right. The system places a person whose conscience merely seeks the freedom to quietly worship in the exact same legal category as a totalizing ideological movement that views civil governance as a tool for comprehensive societal transformation.
And the system just treats them exactly the same.
It has to. Because the procedural machinery was never built to make that kind of qualitative distinction. You can't look at intent.
You know, it's like, let me try another analogy here. It's like a public library.
Oh, I like library analogies. Let's hear it.
So imagine a public library that has this strict foundational rule. Everyone is welcome.
A great rule.
A beautiful rule. And that rule works perfectly if one person wants to come in to read poetry and another person wants to come in to read history.
Right. Two different interests, perfectly compatible with the library.
Exactly. But the system completely breaks down if one person wants to read a book and the other person only wants to use the everyone is welcome rule to get inside so they can burn the library down.
Yes.
The library's rules treat both people exactly the same because all it checks is whether they walked quietly through the front door. It doesn't check if one of them is carrying gasoline.
That is a perfect encapsulation of procedural tolerance. The rules are blind to the gasoline. Or, to put it in tech terms, it's like a computer's operating system.
Okay, yeah, let's talk tech.
Think about an operating system that is designed to be perfectly neutral. It doesn't judge the apps you download, right? It just provides the memory, the processing power, the file access to run the code.
Right, doesn't care if I'm running a word processor or playing solitaire.
Exactly. That neutrality is fantastic if you're downloading normal software. But if you download a piece of malware, the operating system doesn't suddenly develop a moral conscience and stop it.
Oh.
The malware uses the exact same neutral code pathways, the exact same file access rules to encrypt your hard drive and destroy the computer. The OS treats the word processor and the malware as legally equivalent lines of code.
That is so precise because the procedural machinery of our republic basically is the operating system.
It is. It has no built-in mechanism to identify political malware because it only looks at the code structure.
Right, it just asks procedural questions like, did this movement fill out the proper paperwork for their parade permit?
Yep. Did they hold a peaceful rally? Did they register their voters before the deadline?
It doesn't look at the intent of the movement. It doesn't ask, hey, if these guys win the election, are they going to cancel the next election?
Exactly. It cannot distinguish between a resident and a demolitions expert. And because it lacks that ability, its very defenses become weaponized against it.
And this brings us to section 4 of the outline, which is the inversion of safeguards. And I have to say, this is where Thornberry's analysis gets genuinely terrifying.
It is a dark turn in the essay, for sure.
Because the system doesn't just fail to stop the malware, it actively protects the malware while it deletes the hard drive.
Let's look at the specific constitutional protections that get inverted here. Think about free speech, due process, freedom of assembly, the prohibition on religious tests for office.
The bedrock of our civil rights.
Right. What is the original intended function of these safeguards?
Well, they're meant to protect the individual from the state. They guarantee that every citizen has a voice. And they're designed to prevent the government from concentrating arbitrary power and just crushing dissent.
Yes. They force all political conflict into a managed procedural arena.
They keep the fight in the courtroom, not the streets.
Exactly. But when a totalizing movement enters, and by totalizing, I mean a movement whose goal is not to debate tax policy within the framework, but to reconstitute the framework itself, these protections do not slow that movement down.
They accelerate it.
They absolutely accelerate it.
This brings to mind the most striking quote from the essay, the one we highlighted earlier. Thornberry writes, "The doors that were built to keep conscience free now let the Renovator in with his blueprints. He does not break the lock. He uses the key."
It is such a chillingly accurate description because this is active subversion operating entirely within legal norms.
Right. The Renovator doesn't have to kick the door down.
No, he just smiles and turns the key provided by the First Amendment. A totalizing movement today doesn't need to launch an armed rebellion.
Which would be wildly inefficient anyway.
And it would likely fail immediately. The military would crush an armed rebellion. Instead, they use freedom of speech to broadcast a message that delegitimizes free speech.
Oh, wow. They use speech to attack speech.
Yes. They use freedom of assembly to organize mass movements against the foundational order. They use democratic contestation, literally the ballot box, to gain the power necessary to rewrite the rules of democratic contestation.
They capture the institutions using the exact mechanisms designed to keep the institutions open and free.
Institutional capture through complete legal compliance.
But surely, I mean, if a movement is openly stating that they want to dismantle the foundational rights of the society, if they're saying the quiet part out loud, the society steps in, right?
You'd think so.
If the malware is actively broadcasting its intent to destroy the OS, why doesn't the user just pull the plug on the computer?
Because of what Thornberry identifies as a deep philosophical vacuum at the heart of modern democracies.
A philosophical vacuum.
Yes. Over the last century, we have essentially replaced substantive moral clarity with neutral proceduralism.
Okay, we need to pause here, because this is a dense concept. I really need you to break down procedural liberalism for me.
All right.
Because in academic circles, that term gets thrown around a lot, almost like a slur sometimes. But what does it actually look like in everyday life?
Think about the Department of Motor Vehicles.
The DMV.
Or a local zoning board. These are the ultimate expressions of proceduralism.
Okay, I'm tracking.
The DMV doesn't care if you are a good person.
Yeah.
It doesn't care why you need a driver's license. It doesn't care if you're driving to volunteer at a soup kitchen or if you're driving to a hate group rally.
It just cares about the paperwork.
Right. It only cares if you filled out Form 4B correctly, if you passed the vision test, and if you pay the $40 fee. If you follow the procedure, you get the license. The procedure is king.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, procedural liberalism attempts to run an entire civilization on this exact logic.
Wait, really? The whole civilization?
Yes. It says that the state should be completely agnostic about what the good life is. The state shouldn't have a moral compass. It should only focus on maintaining a fair, neutral set of rules for people to pursue their own individual versions of the good life.
Which I have to say, playing devil's advocate here, that sounds incredibly fair. It sounds like the ultimate form of equality.
It does. It sounds wonderfully tolerant. Until it encounters a movement that doesn't believe in the DMV at all, but uses Form 4B to get a commercial truck license so they can drive a bulldozer through the DMV headquarters.
Right, because the DMV didn't check if they hated the DMV.
Exactly. Procedural liberalism can brilliantly describe how it operates. It can map out the courts, it can draw voting districts, it can list the rights of the accused, but by its own internal logic, it cannot furnish a moral reason for why it should survive.
Wait, why can't it?
Because it cannot say, our system of tolerance is morally superior to your system of coercion.
Oh. Because the moment it claims moral superiority,
It is no longer neutral.
it violates its own prime directive.
Exactly. It's caught in a paradox. If it asserts a moral truth, it ceases to be a purely procedural system.
So if the society tries to defend itself by claiming that freedom is objectively better than tyranny, it violates its own rule of neutrality.
Yes,
It literally becomes a suicide pact.
that's a strong way to put it, but yes. When a society treats the preservation of its own foundational order as morally neutral, when it treats its own survival as just another policy preference, no more inherently valid than the totalizing ideology trying to destroy it, it has already conceded the ground.
It has surrendered before the fight even started.
You simply cannot fight a movement that possesses a burning, totalizing moral vision with a procedural flowchart.
A flowchart doesn't inspire anyone to man the barricades.
Exactly. You need a substantive account of what a society is actually for. You need to be able to look at the totalizing movement and say, the distinction between a free conscience and a coercive state isn't just one administrative arrangement among many. It is a moral truth, and we will defend it.
But if a society has forgotten how to speak that moral language because they've been running on the DMV logic for so long, what happens? Do the institutions just collapse overnight? Do we wake up to a dictatorship?
Thornberry argues that they usually don't fall to a sudden, violent coup. They collapse through paralysis.
Paralysis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Institutions decay because no one inside them can articulate, in language that commands widespread assent, why they should be defended.
Because all they have is the flowchart language.
Right. So when the totalizing movement uses the legal machinery to attack the system, the defenders are just paralyzed by self-doubt. They look at each other and ask, well, they followed the rules on Form 4B. Who are we to tell them they can't change the system?
The safeguards don't fail, they paralyze.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in the face of a movement that knows exactly what it wants, paralysis is indistinguishable from surrender.
Paralysis is indistinguishable from surrender. Man, that perfectly diagnoses the feeling of helplessness so many people have right now when they watch institutions being captured.
It really hits home, doesn't it?
It does. You see it happening, you know, in your gut. It's violating the spirit of the system, but you can't point to a specific procedural rule they broke. So you just watch it happen.
Which is exactly why Thornberry pivots the essay at this point. He paints this incredibly dire, almost suffocating picture of the problem, but he insists very explicitly that this is not a call to panic.
Well, that's a relief, because I was starting to panic a little.
Right, but he says panic is the posture of people who just realize the house is on fire and start running around aimlessly screaming.
Okay.
What is needed, he says, is a posture of people who see the fire, accurately name it, and then calmly reach for the water.
So how do we find the water? Because if the government can't save us because the government is just the neutral OS, the plumbing, where does the defense actually come from?
It requires returning to a shared civilizational grammar. And Thornberry lays out 4 practical ways communities can begin to restore this. These are the 4 pillars for restoration.
Okay, let's go through these pillars. This is the what do we do about it part of the deep dive. What's the first step?
The first step is regaining the capacity for categorization.
Categorization.
Yes. We have to stop treating all worldviews as functionally equivalent.
Okay, but again, I have to push back here on behalf of the listener. Who gets to draw that line?
It's the hardest question.
It is, because historically, every time a society decides certain ideologies are dangerous and not worthy of procedural protection, they end up suppressing marginalized groups, silencing legitimate dissent, and creating the exact tyranny they claim to be preventing.
Yes, the slippery slope is real.
How do you draw a line between a legitimate conscience and a subversive political theology without just becoming a dictator yourself?
That is the most difficult needle to thread in a free society. But Thornberry argues that refusing to thread it guarantees the destruction of the society.
So you have to risk threading it.
You have to. And the way you draw the line is not by outlawing bad ideas or suppressing policy disagreements. It is about identifying the specific mechanism of coercion.
The mechanism of coercion. Explain that.
The line is drawn based on whether a movement accepts the permanent settlement of the Constitution or whether it actively seeks to capture the coercive apparatus of the state to enforce its own orthodoxy.
So it's not about judging their theology at all.
Not at all. It's about judging their relationship to state power.
Okay, so if a group says, we believe our religion is the one true faith, and we want the freedom to preach it, the system protects them.
Absolutely, 100%.
But if the group says, we believe our religion is the one true faith, and we want to use the police and the courts to force everyone else to live by our holy book, they have crossed the line from conscience to coercion.
Precisely. Recognizing the difference isn't bigotry. It isn't intolerance. It is the absolute minimum moral clarity required for a free society to function.
Tolerance is a peace treaty between competing factions.
Yes, a peace treaty. It is not a suicide pact. If one party violates the terms of the treaty by attempting to capture the state's coercive power to eliminate their rivals, treating them as if they are merely exercising their First Amendment rights is a catastrophic failure of categorization.
Because if you can't draw that line, someone else will draw it for you.
A system that cannot draw that line will inevitably be captured by the first movement that can.
Which brings us to the second pillar. And this one seems to directly challenge a very American myth.
It does. The second pillar is recognizing that procedural tolerance is not self-sustaining.
Right, and this goes to our tendency in America to speak about the Constitution as if it enforces itself.
Oh, we do this all the time.
If a crisis happens, people say, well, that's unconstitutional, as if the document is going to leap out of the National Archives, fly across Washington, and arrest someone.
It's what Madison called the parchment barrier. We have this illusion that words on a page have magical stopping power, but documents don't enforce themselves.
Right, people enforce them.
Exactly. And more importantly, they are enforced by people who believe the order described in the document is worth preserving before the text is even open.
Before it's even open. So the belief has to precede the law.
It has to. You cannot legislate a moral foundation into existence. The Constitution assumes a moral people. It cannot create them.
So if the moral foundation doesn't come from the text, and it doesn't come from the government because the state is just the neutral plumbing, where on earth does it come from? That brings us to Pillar 3.
Pillar 3. Understand where the responsibility actually falls. It falls on civil communities.
Civil communities.
Yes. This is where the true responsibility lies. The state cannot produce the moral seriousness that makes rights worth protecting. It can only protect those rights once they already exist in the hearts of the citizens.
So where is that civilizational grammar generated?
It's generated in the physical, local, everyday institutions. Churches, families, neighborhood associations, Rotary clubs, youth sports leagues.
Okay, I want you to walk me through the mechanics of that. Because I think it's easy to say family and church, but how does eating dinner with your family or joining a local Rotary club actually protect the constitutional order from ideological subversion? What is the transmission mechanism there?
It is about learning the limits of coercion.
And the limits of coercion.
Right. Think about being in a healthy local community. You have to interact with people you disagree with, but you don't have the power to arrest them.
Right, I can't call the police because my neighbor likes the wrong sports team or wants to plant an ugly tree.
Exactly. If you are on a neighborhood committee and you fiercely disagree about where to put a new stop sign, you have to use persuasion.
You have to talk to them.
You have to talk. You have to compromise. You have to learn how to lose a vote gracefully, shake hands, and still show up to the community barbecue the next day.
Because you still have to live next to them.
Yes. These small institutions train the citizen in the habits of pluralism. They teach you, on a micro level, what you owe your neighbor.
You learn the civilizational grammar in the microcosm.
That's beautifully put. You learn that disagreement is not an existential threat.
You learn that the person across the table is just a human being, not some obstacle to be liquidated.
Exactly. But if those small institutions weaken, if the families fragment, if the Rotary clubs empty out, if people stop going to church or local meetings, the citizen never learns the distinction between persuasion and coercion.
They lose the training ground.
They do. They grow up viewing every single disagreement as a zero-sum war. And when that happens, the constitutional order doesn't fail immediately.
It fails eventually.
It fails eventually because the foundation has turned to sand.
It's like a tree, right?
Yeah.
It's like a massive oak tree whose root system has completely rotted away underground.
I love that analogy.
The tree might still look perfectly strong and green for an entire summer. You wouldn't know anything is wrong just by looking at the branches.
Right, the leaves are still there.
But the first major storm that rolls through in the fall will blow it completely over because there is no foundational anchor left. And by the time the failure of the root system is visible to the people looking at the tree, it is way too late to fix it.
That is exactly the danger of relying entirely on the legal system to save us. The legal system is the branches.
Ah.
If the families and civic associations, the roots break down, the republic inevitably follows. Because the citizens literally no longer possess the moral vocabulary to defend the house. They don't know why the doors that open both ways are valuable in the first place, so they just stand by while someone changes the locks.
Wow. Okay, so this leads us to the fourth and final pillar, which I think is a necessary caution.
Very necessary.
Because if we acknowledge this vulnerability, if we truly recognize that there are ideological movements operating as malware within the system,
Right.
How do we avoid becoming completely paranoid?
It's a real danger.
Because if I start looking at every political opponent as a potential arsonist trying to burn down the house, I'm going to want to tear up the peace treaty myself. I'll want to use the state to crush them before they crush me.
Which is the exact trap. And that brings us to the fourth pillar. We have to be alert to the asymmetry without being governed by it.
Alert, but not governed by it.
Right. When one side treats the rules as a permanent settlement and the other treats them as a temporary tactic, the contest is no longer symmetric. Acknowledging that reality is not paranoia.
It's just basic self-preservation.
Exactly. You have to identify the fire. But, and this is the crucial part, that recognition cannot become the entirety of your political life.
Because if a society defines itself entirely by the threats it perceives, it loses the very thing it is trying to protect.
Yeah.
Going back to the library analogy, if you become so obsessed with the fact that an arsonist might use the public library, you might decide the safest thing to do is weld the library doors shut, turn off the lights, and put armed guards at the perimeter.
And you've solved the arson problem.
Congratulations, you kept the arsonist out. But you also destroyed the library yourself. No one can read books anymore.
You've adopted the tactics of the totalizing movement in order to defeat it. You've merged faith and coercion. You've become the monster to fight the monster.
Right.
As Thornberry reminds us, the house is worth defending because of the life that happens inside it, not because of the enemies trying to get in. You defend the procedural safeguards so that liberty of conscience can continue to exist, not so you can build a fortress of ideological purity.
So you have to maintain the structural integrity of the doors that open both ways, even knowing the risk, because the alternative is locking everyone inside.
Precisely. The survival of the house ultimately depends on the residents inside recognizing that the house is a home, not a construction site waiting to be leveled.
Man, if we step back and look at the entire blueprint we've just examined today, it is incredibly sobering.
It really makes you see the headlines differently.
It does. We started with the founders, who were just deeply traumatized by a century and a half of religious bloodshed, designing a system that structurally isolated divine mandate from civil coercion.
The wiring and the plumbing.
Right. They built a system of procedural tolerance. But because they assumed everyone shared their civilizational grammar, They left a massive blind spot.
And that blind spot is the legal equivalency of all worldviews, which creates this fatal asymmetry when the system is probed by a totalizing movement.
The malware uses the operating system's neutral rules, free speech, due process to corrupt the system from within, bypassing the constitutional safeguards by weaponizing them.
Exactly.
And because our modern society is so paralyzed by procedural liberalism, the DMV logic, we lack the moral vocabulary to stop it. We watch the Renovator use the key to bring in blueprints for demolition, and we freeze.
We freeze because we don't know how to assert that our foundational order is objectively worth saving without feeling like we're violating our own rules of neutrality.
But the antidote is not a stronger central government or a more aggressive legal strategy.
No, the antidote is local.
It requires communities to draw a firm line between liberty of conscience and political coercion. It requires us to recognize that the parchment of the Constitution only holds power if the culture sustains it.
The roots of the tree.
Right. And it requires a heavy, heavy investment in the physical, local institutions, families, churches, civic groups that teach citizens the moral truths that make freedom possible in the first place.
That is the only way the house stands.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you, the listener, with today.
Let's hear it.
We spent a lot of time discussing how the moral seriousness required to keep this massive constitutional order alive is actually generated in the smallest, most physical communities.
Yes.
The dinner table, the town hall, the neighborhood association. But I want you to look at the trajectory of our modern lives right now. We are becoming increasingly digital, atomized, and completely disconnected from our physical geography.
Oh, without a doubt. We spend vastly more time arguing about national politics with anonymous avatars on a screen than we do negotiating a shared physical space with our actual neighbors.
Exactly. If the local physical community is the root system that prevents the tree from falling over, what happens when an entire society moves its life onto the internet?
That is the million-dollar question.
Are we accidentally abandoning the very institutions that generate the water needed to put out the fire? If you never have to learn how to peacefully disagree with a neighbor about a stop sign because you can just block them online and retreat to an echo chamber, do you lose the civilizational grammar entirely?
It is a profound vulnerability. A disconnected, purely digital society, one that relies heavily on procedural rules but has abandoned the local institutions of moral formation, might actually be the most fragile society of all.
Something to think about the next time you walk through a door that opens both ways. We really hope this deep dive gave you some structural insight into the architecture of the Republic and perhaps a new appreciation for the heavy lifting your local communities are doing. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking at the blueprints, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.